Hi, I'm Renee Tucci, and today we're going to create a hand-tied bouquet using the spiral technique, and we're going to finish it off with the sheltering technique. Okay, before we get started actually constructing any type of bouquet, the most important part is to prepare your stems, to clean them entirely so that you've got a really clean bundle of stems that you're working with. So briefly, I'll review what we're going to be working with here today. We've got some spray roses, which are miniature roses that come multiples on each stem. We've got Hypericum berry in a beautiful peachy pink tone. We've got magenta peonies. I've got some dried protea. We're going to mix dried in with the fresh flowers. Yes, it's totally possible. We've got some cherry brandy roses. This is a filler called Buplorum. And we've got some baker fern that's going to act as our collar. Now for each one of these, I'm going to go ahead and, like I said, clean the stem entirely. For the baker fern example, I'm going to just pluck off these lower laterals since I only need the top of it. It's going to act like the collar as the finish around the rest of the flowers. So I only need the tips of those. For the Buplorum, it is multi-branched. So I'm going to go through and selectively dissect the stem so that we have shorter pieces that are cleaned and ready to go. And of course the stem needs to be long enough to reach the bottom of the bouquet. So we wouldn't be able to cut something like this, for example, and use it on its own. But if we leave it attached to the main stem, we can use it on its own. So we'll go ahead and fix up all the Buplorum stems to see how much we can get out of them. For the roses, we will simply pull off all of the leaves, strip those down. The protea are ready to go. The peonies, again, stripping the leaves. Same with the Hypericum, including the leaves at the very top. We're going to go ahead and pluck those off because they're just going to add to, we want to keep a clean look, and that's going to help. And also these leaves are the ones that are going to go down first. So we just want to take those out of the equation. And then with the spray roses, same thing here. We're just going to take any leaves off the stem. So here we go. Okay, now we've got all of our stems prepped and ready for the bouquet. I did want to mention that for the roses specifically, as you go through and denude the stems of all the leaves, you'll also want to check the heads of the roses. Make sure there's no petals that are chewed or torn or looking not great in any way. You can just go ahead and pluck those off. And for the spray roses, same thing, check those heads as well. And you'll need to sacrifice any lower blossoms because they won't be seen. Of course, with a bouquet, you're really just seeing the top of the flower, and they'll just contribute to excess bulk in the center of the bouquet, and that won't help make a pretty bouquet. So we're gonna go ahead and get rid of anything that won't really just lay right at the top part of the bouquet. All right, so let's get started. The technique to making a spiral bouquet is very simple. It really is all about repetition. And I do, of course, talk about a spiral bouquet technique in my book, Framing Floral Techniques. You can check the link down below to check out that book. It's great for technique exploration. But basically, you start with a stem, any stem, and that's going to be straight up and down. Then you take your second stem, whatever that may be, and you're going to put that on a 45-degree angle to your first stem. Then you'll take these two stems, grasp them, and rotate it a quarter of a turn so that your spray rose, which was on the side, and in this case it was my left, now it's facing me. So now I'll take my next stem and I'll do the same thing. I'll put it at a 45-degree angle to where my main cluster is. Then I will grasp, turn the bouquet a quarter turn, and repeat. And we just continue this process where we're putting our flowers in on an angle, and then grasp and turn the bouquet, and repeat. And there really is no pattern as far as what flower you should pick up when. You'll want to keep an eye on what you're putting in, of course, depending on the look you're going for. You may not want to put multiples of the same flower next to each other, but you'll just keep practicing this movement, this routine, And once you get, quite a few in your hand, you can even do 2 stems at a time. You don't have to do just one. That will help with speed, of course, if you start layering in 2 stems at a time and then do the turn. With practice, I recommend starting with 1 stem just until you get this muscle memory down of the placement on an angle and then the rotating of the bouquet. So I'm going to keep going here. This is what it looks like so far. I'm going to keep going here, and I'll see you in a minute. Okay, so I'm going to keep going here. You'll see I have more stems to add yet, but I wanted to just pause and show you where we're at. So by continuing to place the stems on that angle between each rotation, that is what creates the definition of a spiral, where all of the stems are going along the same axis. None of them are crossing. So you'll see all of my stems are coming on this angle because I was placing the stems this way and then I was rotating. But if I then took this rose and I put it in on an opposing angle, that really changes the way the stems are arranged, and it makes the bouquet bulkier, and it allows for the possibility of breakage. When you go to grasp those stems and really secure it at the end of the bouquet, it can allow for the stems to break. So you just want to continue to stay along that same axis. Now, it's completely fine if you want, as you're going and you want to layer in. So for example, I'd like to see some of these berries a little further in. I'll just loosen my grasp a bit and sort of nestle that stem in there, but still going along that same axis. And I'll continue to go around and around here, and we'll see you in a minute. Okay, we're back, and I've included all of my flowers, main flowers, in the bouquet here. A few housekeeping notes. As you're doing this bouquet, keep your grip from your main hand. In this case, I'm right-handed, so I'm holding the bouquet in my left hand and adding everything in with my right, doing the turning of the bouquet with my right, but my left hand just remains the holder. That's the gig this hand has. But after a while, you could start to get a cramp. So you want to make sure you're holding the bouquet pretty loose. Make sure you're taking care of your hands there. And then it's really important to understand your materials when you're working with something like a bouquet where the flowers are going to be out of water. So for example, the Buplorum that I have here, it is a wilt easy flower. It happens to be very thirsty. So I try to be strategic about where I place that in the bouquet. I try to place it at least 1 layer inside, although there might be, a few pieces wanting to come out, but at least 1 layer inside and not too much sticking up, because if it does start to wilt, the flowers around it will help hold it in place. Okay, so now we're ready to finish. We've got our baker fern that we have stripped all the bottom laterals off of, and we are going to wrap this right around the bottom of the flowers, again creating our collar, which is another technique called collaring. Very simple definition there. And that just finishes the bouquet, gives it a nice clean look. Now you can see, even though I have a lot of stems up here, I've got a nice tight and tidy binding point here, and that's what we want in a bouquet, especially a spiral bouquet. That's where we're going to bind or secure our bouquet. So I have a roll of 1/4 inch waterproof tape, and I have pre-torn myself a piece of it here, and right where that spiral is gathered, right where I was holding it the entire time, I'm going to go ahead and do 3 or 4 wraps with this bouquet, nice and tight. Not so tight that I'm going to snap any flowers, but I want to make sure each time I turn it that I'm really pulling the tape before I wrap. So like I said, you get a nice tight bind. There we go. And you can see how the stems are splaying out on the bottom. That means we've got a great spiral going. So now we're going to go ahead and trim the stems and add some ribbon. Another way to tell if you've got a great spiral is if that stands up on its own after you've cut it. That means your stems are splaying out perfectly and you've got a nice straight cut. You've got yourself a beautiful flower soldier standing up right on its own. Now when I cut my stems, I usually allow for about 2 hand widths for a bride or a bridesmaid to hold, and then Generally, I'm working a day or two ahead on an event, so I might make this earlier in the week and then keep it in my floral cooler until the day of the event. So I'll leave the stems just a bit longer and give them a fresh cut the morning of the wedding. Now, I mentioned that we were going to finish the bouquet with a sheltering technique, and we're going to do that with Equisetum here today. Now, sheltering is exactly what it sounds like. It's when you take a material and you lightly cover other florals with that material, and you create negative space between the sheltering material and the main florals, and the viewer is drawn into what might be underneath that shelter. It creates a feeling of safety and intrigue. So we're going to use the Equisetum to create some intrigue in our bouquet today. This is in the bamboo family. It's also sometimes called rush. And the great thing about Equisetum is that it's hollow. So we can do something like take a piece of wire. In this case, I have an 18-inch piece of 18 gauge wire, and down the top of the stem, I can insert that wire, and like any type of bamboo, there are segments along the stem, and at each of those segments there is an internal layer that you'll need to get through. So if you just press your wire a little bit when you feel that resistance, it'll go right down to the next section. So I've done that now until my wire disappeared, and I'm going to do that for several more. Now, if you find yourself a piece of Equisetum that still has its top connected, it has a little dome across the top, don't worry, you can just snip that off, and that will allow you to get to the hollow inside of the Equisetum. Again, we're just going to take a piece of wire and thread it right through the top until it disappears. Now I've got all of my Equisetum pre-wired, and I'm going to go ahead and start adding them to my spiral bouquet. So again, I'm going to follow that spiral where I can see how the stems are going. So I'm going to layer all these Equisetum in on what looks at this minute to be a wacky angle where they're all splaying out, but stick with me. We're going to bring those in just a moment. Okay, so now we've got about 8 or 9 pieces of Equisetum sticking out here. We're going to use the wire that we added in to bend the Equisetum over and above the bouquet. And this is going to create that sheltering technique that we talked about. And the great part is that you've got this long piece of wire inside, and you can use that to bend the Equisetum as many times and in as many directions as you'd like. So you can start to play around with the kind of depth that you want to achieve, and perhaps bring in some peaks or keep some pieces closer down to the flowers. You'll want to play with these pieces. Make sure the wires are really bent on a nice angle so that you get that beautiful, intriguing, unexpected shelter over your bouquet. Okay, so I have played around with all my different pieces and gotten my wires just the way I want them. So now I need to tape off again. I've got another piece of tape ready to go here, and right at that same binding point, I'm going to spin this around a few times just to hold my Equisetum into place over the layer that we already created with the rest of the stems. And then go ahead and trim the excess Equisetum. Okay, our last step to finishing this bouquet is just covering our mechanics here. So I've got a piece of double-faced satin ribbon, and I'm just going to lay it on that binding point and wrap it around 2 or 3 times until I've gotten a nice clean finish to where it's going to be held. You want to make sure you cover up the initial tail or the start of that ribbon, especially if there's any frayed edges. You'll cover those up. Make it as clean or as rouged as you like. I like a little bit of rouging in my ribbon. I feel like it's a nice texture for the bride or the bridesmaid to hold. When I get to the end of my ribbon, I'll tuck that end under and just hold it in place with 2 or 3 pearl-headed pins. Okay, our bouquet is ribbon wrapped. Our piece is finished. You're just going to want to coat this with a finishing spray and then store it in a small amount of water until the day of the event. Thanks so much for joining in. I hope you've learned a tip or technique and that you have a great day.